We both love that quote, you should always build a larger table rather than a higher wall. And I think food is food diplomacy is something that will bring us together when the world is falling apart in so many other ways. And for me, Spice Mama was my small contribution to that.
Such wise words from Shaheen Hughes. Today I'm being treated to a delicious curry and wonderful conversation at the warm table of renowned jewellery artist Sultana Shamshi. Shaheen and her mother Sultana are the creative founders of Spice Mama, a movement of making curries while telling stories and sharing the histories which are written almost invisibly in the pages of our recipe books, in our embroidery and the work of women. It all started in Bombay, which is where we'll start today. I'm Sonia Nolan, and I'm so pleased you've joined me at my warm table. Sultana, can you take us back there and tell us the senses of Bombay and the type of environment you grew up in?
Bombay has always been a special city, the way New Yorkers consider themselves New Yorkers before they consider themselves American. And, big cities like London, New York, Bombay, they're cosmopolitan. They are a part of a country, but not really a part of it. They belong to themselves. And I feel so privileged growing up in Bombay because the Bombay of my generation was post-independence. And there was an energy in Bombay, a multiculturalism that I haven't seen since anywhere, except maybe in London, that was so embracing and revitalizing. Everyone loved their own diversity and still being a part of a united India, that we had kicked colonialism, thrown the Brits out, we were reclaiming who we were. And Bombay was the essence of it. It was in the heart of this, I feel, because we are a colonial city founded by the British, but we made it ours. And as a young girl, a teenager, it was exhilarating being in Bombay.
It just sounds like a time gone too.
It has. It doesn't exist anymore, that, unfortunately. And I feel sad when I go back to Bombay because the divisiveness that has now permeated in Indian society is a very sad thing to see. Indians are not naturally a divisive people. They love embracing different cultures. They're very interested in other cultures, and all Indians. But somehow you get a leader that catches hold of this dark force, and you have some people who follow it, and that creates these splits. And my heart breaks now that we've lost that very essence of the best of humanity.
There is so much within that. I want to go to the glimpses of hope, because Shaheen, a couple of years back, you led us through Bombay Dreaming. So I was so privileged to tack on to that adventure with you, where you took a group of, or both of you took a group of women, I think it was 8 of us in total was there, and we went to Bombay, or Mumbai as it is known now, and you just opened up this magical world for me. I had never been to India, nor had it sort of been on my radar. So I'm just so thankful that we had that experience. So take us through that trip.
Yeah, so I guess for me, the opposite of divisiveness and polarity and some of the darkness in the world today is hope and joy. And for me, growing up, straddled between so many cultures, feeling very part of Bombay, but also being part of Australia, I see so much more light than I do dark. The idea of revisiting the country of my birth and the country of mum's birth with a group of people I loved very much and was so honoured accompanied us was, I think, a way to visit the joy and visit the hope in humanity. And I think we went to the heart of some really beautiful places like Dharavi Slum, for example.
Yeah, if I just touch on that for a moment, Shaheen. So the Dharavi slum is where they filmed Slumdog Millionaire, that movie that, again was just an incredible movie for everyone to watch and get a glimpse of India in a different way. And I was fascinated that in the Dharavi slum, and I think slum's just a word that we don't understand because it's a village, it's a community, and they were the most productive community in India.
I think they're pretty amazing in terms of the ingenuity and productivity of the people who live there. And really, just to flip the script on this narrative that one, India and Bombay are third world nations, which really they never were, leave alone Bombay growing up. But India has been one of the most rich, beautiful, diverse countries, really the engine room that, fed the wealth of colonization is actually still to be found there. And instead of invoking darkness and pity and fear, to actually see at the heart of this so called darkness so much joy and so much light and so much energy, and the children, children going to school in beautifully pressed white shirts, and that lovely boy that took us around who was studying, I think, engineering.
He
He was
spoke
going.
4 languages.
Yes, intelligent, articulate, and so welcoming.
Yeah.
And welcoming is a word that I think sums up Bombay really well. And I think the approach I think both of us take to all the work we do, how do we welcome people? How do we make people feel like they belong? And often the precedents for that are not in the culture that we live with today. We're finding them more and more in our traditional cultures, in the, I find belonging and welcome looking back into my past, and I want to take that gift with me into the future. I think that's a real signature of my work is to look at the wealth of the resources and the passion and the spirit of the cultures that we come from.
Definitely that welcoming idea is something that I like to bring in the Tavala Kalda, because that comes from my background as well, this idea of a hospitable table where we sit around and we talk about things that are important. Back to India and Spice Mama, which brings us all to the table together. It's something that is so special to your heart and comes very much from the recipes of your grandmother.
Absolutely. The recipes of my grandmother, but also my mother, my other grandmother, my great grandmother wrote recipes. And they were these beautiful sort of tokens from the past that seemed not to just tell me how to cook, but to tell me how to live and to be, and through which I could feel these women, these matriarchs, these elders of my background who are not here anymore, and gave me a very sort of visceral way to connect with them. We sit, when mum and I are lonely, we sit together and eat. Mum will make a delicious curry, or I know when you're missing your mum, you'll make a delicious kind of biryani, and we'll eat it and we'll talk. And there's not many problems that can't be resolved through food. So through Spice Mama, we found a vehicle to introduce others to our culture, the way we sit, the way we talk, the way we eat, the food we cook, the concept of mindfulness around food, the concept of memory being really interwoven in the food we eat. Famously, that Proustian moment where he ate the Madeleine and recalled the memory of his childhood. I think sometimes we miss in the everyday when we're gulping down meals and we're busy. And if we just sat together and used food as this vehicle to transport us back to our past, back to our memories, to the things that we share together, I think we both love that quote, you should always build a larger table rather than a higher wall. And I think food is food diplomacy is something that will bring us together when the world is falling apart in so many other ways. And for me, Spice Mama was my small contribution to that.
really latches onto the memory and the taste of food. I know my own family, my own parents coming from Italy. My dad would want the polenta and the minestrone and the trippa, the tripe, which I don't know why you'd want to go there with that memory. Still, they're all memories of his childhood. And my mum had her minestrone was called a furigishka from her place in Italy. And so all of those taste just brought back the memory of being, I don't know, a more simple time.
I think recipe books are quite subversive. And I've now met people who collect recipe books because the layers that are hidden in a recipe book, they're almost like a playbook of the times that the women wrote the recipe, because the ingredients in some of the recipes are not available now. The
True.
measurements of the recipes, the amount of ingredients they used, one wouldn't use that now. It's over the top. But so women wrote about what they did and how they cooked, which, if you sort of peel away the layers, it reveals the lives they led in a way. And recipe books were mainly written by women, and the ones that were handwritten, so they kind of reveal themselves in a very subtle, hidden way, mysterious way, through the food that they cooked and they wrote down and passed on.
That's if they passed them on, Sultana, because sometimes they were so secret that they
They
didn't
didn't
pass them
want, they
on.
didn't pass them on. So to get hold of someone's handwritten recipe book was like a discovering a hidden treasure. And even the colonial measurements that my mother-in-law's mother's recipes have, the tolas and the mons and all,
A cigarette tin of
a cigarette
rice.
tin of rice, things, and you thought, right, it kind of, it is a piece, a slice of history.
Yes, what was to
Uh,
hand is how they measured
with
things.
And it is an unself-conscious piece of history, because when male historians write history, they're very self-conscious, and they write it in a very like there's no they write it in a scientific kind of way with dates and things and treaties and all. But when women write these, they write it as fact, what's happening day to day.
It's so true. And I know, even reading some colonial Australian history, and you read the men's version of it, and it is, we sailed at, X compass degrees, and we
Yes,
then did this,
yes.
and this is what we ate, and all the rest. Whereas the women's recollection of that, the few that you can find, are imbued with emotion. This is how we felt, and this is what was happening in relationships, and this is, they describe the complexity and the layers of people and joy.
Also, it's a food history, obviously, and on a subtle level as to the recipes revealed what was available easily, what was a scarcity,
Yes.
what were precious foods, what were common foods, and what were introduced foods from their backgrounds. So, through my mother-in-law's recipe books, you can trace the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Indonesian backgrounds because of the spices they used and what they used more of and less of. And that is so interesting. You could decode a recipe book and write the story of that woman.
Tell me how. Like, how would you know that there's a Portuguese influence in an Indian dish?
Well, I guess so. My family, the Goan part of my family, are D'Souza's, and one of the most telling moments in history was called the Columbian Exchange. It was when two great men, great in inverted commas, one sailed Christopher Columbus to America. Vasco da Gama sailed to supposedly discover, again in quote marks, India. And they found at each of their ports the most incredible array of food. So, for example, from the Americas came chili and tomatoes and potatoes and foods the world had not seen before, cashews, which ended up in marzipan and, in
Yeah.
our kaju bofi. Da Gama discovered the spice route, so all of the cloves and the cinnamon and the nutmeg and all of these different spices, the peppers. The Portuguese brought dishes like vindaloo, for example, with them to India, landed in Goa with tomatoes and potatoes and chilies, mixed the tomatoes and potatoes and chilies with cinnamon and cloves and garam masala. We suddenly had the birth of a whole new cuisine that would never have happened. And you see this when you read the recipe books. They talk about potatoes and tomatoes and chilies and cashews and cinnamon and cloves and pepper and things that would never have been put together before these historical moments. And that comes through in our food. And my grandmother's special recipe, bottle masala, was an East Indian recipe. East Indians were named after the East India Company because it was these very constructed commercial enterprises that were responsible for the journey of all these food from one port to the other. And the bottle masala contains 20 to sometimes 30 different spices.
That many.
Which would never ever have found their way to each other except
carefully blended.
Yes.
Because some spices can overpower, some are subtle. So they all had to be roasted and blended in very measured ways. Otherwise, you would lose the effect. So it was, in a way, a science that the housewife did. You know, you don't put too much cloves. It's too spicy. It's heaty for your system. You put a lot of cumin and coriander. They're good for your digestion. Things like that. So these new trade routes revealed gave them access to all these spices which had never actually before been accessed. They had been, the different spices had been accessed by people in different times, but they had not been put together in this way. So the coming together of this is quite symbolic because the trade routes were not new or discovered by da Gama or Magellan. They always existed. The Arabs and the Vikings used these trade routes for thousands of years.
Of course.
But it was the European discovery of the trade routes which made it like the world discovery of the trade routes. So the interesting part is the coming together and the blending of these, the way later on globalization caused the coming together of people and cultures and religions.
Curry had already done that.
Curry had done that
I
already.
love it.
I think you can come together for worse or you can come together for better. And I think when we look at the male histories and the male discoveries, and they tore the spice trees out of the ground and they used slaves to harvest them, and there was an inbuilt cruelty to the trade. The spices were, packed onto ships and sold. Whereas I think what the women did with the spices was we put them together in curry. And going back to that, we knew how much was too much and how much was too little, how much would taste good, how much would cure your sore tummy.
They were all
there was
medicinal.
so much care.
Yes, they were used as medicine. And the book that you gave me for my birthday,
Oh, the nutmeg
the
book.
Nutmeg's Curse, that is so beautifully tells the story of the spice trade, and also how much greed got into the way of destroying cultures, because they actually destroyed the island where the nutmeg grew because they didn't want anyone else to get hold of
Because
it.
they've monetized it.
They've
and they've
monetized
taken
it.
away the essence of the purity of it.
Yeah, and for thousands of years, people came and took what they needed and left it. And they treated that island as a sacred space because that was giving them something very valuable. But the Dutch didn't see it that way. They wanted to destroy it to make the price of nutmeg go up, which was a whole different way of thinking. Introduced a concept in a place, literally, it was the serpent in Eden. That kind of brought in an element of greed and cruelty and possession and disruption. And things had worked before that for centuries in a very orderly way. The traders traded. They didn't want to possess and destroy and take a monopoly of things.
Yeah, it was much more sustainable,
It
which
was
meant there was
sustainable.
enough
And that
for
is-
everybody.
If the world was like that, we'd have the perfect world. Everyone just take what you need. You don't have to create monopolies and artificial shortages for the prices to go up and buy stocks and shares. The whole concept that was introduced by the East India Company was the beginning, I think, of the destruction of a beautiful civilization and way of life.
I want to take you back to Bombay and the bottle masala. And I know you've told this story, Shaheen and Sultana, about the secretive element of walking through the streets to get your spices. And I want to hear it from your perspectives, because I just love it when you were telling those stories about the secret behind it. You don't want to be followed.
Oh, I think it's part of what you said about the recipe books being so treasured. These were women's work, women's hearts. So if you had a secret recipe for bottle masala, you really didn't want to tell anyone, because your curries were going to be better than anyone else's.
Talk about the tribal women who came and pounded the masalas.
It was such a process, because you took your 20 to 30 spices and you dried them in the sun, and once a year the women would come in from the villages and roast them in these huge kind of earthenware kind of pots. And
imagine the aroma from that experience.
The aroma of bottle masala, and when I started making it, was actually the aroma that got me in my heart, because when you roast the various, you mentioned that you roast jeera, cumin for a certain amount of time, you roast cinnamon and cloves for a certain amount of time. You don't want things to burn, so the individual aroma of the different spices, like my husband always says, oh, you're making bottle masala, because the whole house smells of cloves and then the whole house smells of cinnamon, and it's almost this kind of narrative created by spices. And I imagine that's what these villages and small communities smelled like, as the bottle masala was being made and ground, and then it would be packed traditionally into old brown beer bottles, which is where it got its name, brown, so they could be stored out of the sun and kept from going kind of dry and sort of flavorless, and they would then be used as your kind of quick curry mix through the year. But it was never packaged. It was always either, in my memory, in a bag, a paper bag.
Each family had its own bottle masala recipe, and it was really important that the nomadic women, the tribal women who came to pound it, that was their job. So they brought these huge wooden mortar and pestles that were like almost a meter high and deep, and then they would kind of sing or chant, perhaps a chant, and it would be pounded in wood. So the flavor was different from the ones that we make with our blenders and the steel blades. So it was slowly pounded in wood. It took a long time to pound it and get it to a very fine grain, so that you wouldn't taste it in a gravy. The powder would dissolve in the gravy. You didn't feel the coarseness of the powder. So that took almost a day of pounding and to go. So the four women with their wooden sort of paddles would sort of dance around that, almost chanting and saying that. So this ceremony, every month of May, which was the hottest month of the year in Bombay.
That's when you would make the bottle masala.
That's when you'd make the bottle, because that's when your spices would be dried on the terraces, on the tops of all the rooftop houses. And I have a clear memory of going to my grandmother's house in Palanpur when I was a little girl of 5 years old, and they were drying all the chilies and all the masalas to make the year's masalas. And I've always loved the color red. And to see these bed sheets spread on my grandmother's terrace with all these red chilies, I ran through it and played with it because they looked so wonderful. And of course, every pore of my skin was burning with the chili oil. And the only way to get the chili oil out was to rub me from head to toe with butter.
Oh, really?
Because the butter would dilute the oil.
Uh-huh.
And since then, I hate butter.
So you were a little butterball who was burning with chilies at the age of 5. Oh, that's an interesting image, Sultana. So tell me some more memories from those times, Sultana, because you did say they're times that have gone. But tell me some more of those memories of what you recall growing up in Bombay and Mumbai. And it was in Colaba, is that right?
Colaba and Marine Lines,
Mm.
we lived. And I, we lived in apartment buildings because Bombay was a highly densely populated city. And my memory as a child was the apartment doors, all the doors of everyone's apartment opened at 7 o'clock in the morning because the traders would come. The man who bought the goat meat, then the man who bought the beef, the man who bought the milk, the eggs, the vegetable seller, the fisherwoman. They would all do their rounds early morning on all the floors. And I feel really bad because most buildings were 4 or 5 stories. And because they were tradesmen, they were not allowed to use the elevators. They had to climb the floors.
Oh, gosh.
Really sad. Okay. So, but you'd hear the clutter in the morning. You'd get up in the morning to the sound of people bargaining for their food, people buying their stuff, the servants being told, and people scolding the poor tradies. There's too much fat in that meat. I put in some more bones. And the butcher would say, Madam, the animal has fat and bones. It's not only meat, so I bring you what the animal is about.
Yes.
And I remember laughing as a child when he
Trying
they
to
were very
educate them.
funny
Yeah, yeah.
because these tradies knew how to argue with the housewives.
Yes.
And hearing the batter first thing in the morning was really funny, and we kids would laugh at them. And so all the food was then bought fresh every morning. The food was cooked twice a day. The lunch was cooked and then dinner was cooked freshly. So the lunch was the main meal of the day, after which everyone had a siesta. So all the shutters were drawn, the house was quietened and darkened, and everyone went to sleep. And most kids were so bored because they didn't want to sleep in the afternoon. So then we'd sneak out of the house in the apartment buildings and meet in the compound and get up to, what was called mischief, but it was very innocent and harmless in those days.
Of course, of course. Shaheen, you've got some of those memories of Colaba growing up as well, haven't you? Because you shared that with us when we were in India.
Oh, absolutely. I think if I had to choose one place on earth where I still feel truly at home, it is that apartment building set in a house in Colaba. And I just remember, very similarly waking up. We had a really large veranda with, beautiful tree outside, which when I was very young, you could still get the odd monkey or two, coming in to steal fruit from. And I just have this, it was just so peaceful, which I think is ironic in Bombay, such a crazy, chaotic city.
In Colaba, the most bustling part of
but there was just this
Bombay,
feeling of
you had that quiet,
of
yes.
peace and quiet, and that apartment had beautiful, like Portuguese sort of tiled floors and mosaics, and very kind of grand, ceilings and old fans. And I still very, very vividly think of, that apartment and the sellers arriving at the door. And we were very close to Apollo Bandar, which is the gateway of India. And I remember the sea, just being able to walk in the evening. Everyone would promenade down to the sea, and you'd see all the women in their incredible neon saris, which is where I've got my color obsession from, and Indian jasmine in their hair. People would get up after their siesta and walk out, and as a child you'd have them sort of carts of food and men roasting corn with lots of sort of lime and chili, and it was just incredible. Like some of my most vivid visual memories, I think, are from that time. And I left India when I was 8, and we had quite a nomadic life for those 8 years. So I certainly hadn't lived in India very long, but it has never, I think, left my heart.
I remember when we were in India, Shaheen, I've never seen you so happy. You were just so happy and settled, and you were home.
It is home. And I think when we talk about home and welcome and belonging and warmth and sitting around a table, these are such ephemeral concepts, particularly up against the very jarring history of colonization that we can all talk about. But these are very magical, intangible concepts that are so strong, they stay with us longer than any book or any history. They're these things we carry in our heart, and I think you've passed it to me, and I will pass it on. And it's that unbroken lineage and that feeling of welcome, of home, and making other people feel at home. I think that is very important in my life now.
Sultana, I want to reflect with you about creativity and what you're discovering now and how you're embracing all of the creativity and the experience and the wisdom that you've gleaned over the years. Tell me about where you're at and how it feels.
I turned 70 this month. And the last 10 years, the decade from my 60s to my 70s, has been the most creative period of my life. It has surprised me because I always considered myself an artist. I always drew from the time my first memory of myself was, from the time you're 4 or 5 years old, I was drawing, creating things. And in school, I was, labeled an artist. And then I went to art school and I studied pottery and drawing and sculpture. And then I got married really early and had Shaheen very early when I was 21. And our nomadic life with my husband Clint being at sea, we sailed, and I loved that bit of my life. I enjoyed the sailing on ships, the water, the traveling, the seeing the world in a different way, not as a tourist, but as, we were not tourists, but I wasn't even working. So I was a passenger on a cargo ship, which was a great way to see the world.
Yes.
But that made me put my creativity in a way on the back burner. But I think the brain was always absorbing ideas and things and storing them. So there is this memory box, this very large, vast, deep memory box that must have been in me that I wasn't even aware of. Because I did miss being able to do stuff, but I was always sewing. And I think as a housewife, your creativity, if it is barred on one way, you manifest it in decorating your home,
Yes.
in your clothes, making yourself your clothes. It comes out. It has to.
It has to, because there's an urgency
There's
about
an
it being
urgency. It
expressed.
has to. So there was sewing clothes for Shaheen, decorating my house, picking up objects, seeing galleries, museums, was the way I expressed it. But it was only when I was on my own at the age of 60 and I went back to TAFE to do my course in jewelry, that it all came gushing out, all those dams that had been built to stop it because it wasn't appropriate at the right time, that burst. And I had 3 wonderful years at Central TAFE in Perth, where I studied jewelry designing and silversmithing. And I have just not looked back because that flow is unstoppable now. I know that young artists have a hunger in their fire in their belly and a hunger that brings out some amazing ideas. But I also think that old age, the accumulated visual wisdom and understanding of life, the heartbreaks, the journey through difficult times, all that add to an understanding of life that you don't have when you're a young person.
And you're not supposed to have.
You can't have, Youth is different. It is free, it is light, it is ephemeral. Everyone knows it'll pass. But in old age, it's all there, this accumulated life experience that then you draw from in your creativity. And I'm amazed how much there is to draw from and how it has now manifested itself in my work with an understanding that is much deeper than as a young person I could have ever had.
So you've become this very renowned artist from your 60s.
Yes, which I never expected. I thought in my 60s that at least I won't die without exploring my creative side. So let me do it. So there was no vision of being renowned or anything. I just wanted to know that I was an artist. And in my 60s, I got the opportunity to be, because you need to learn a technique and a skill, the discipline. You need to focus and be single minded. And when can you be single minded? Only after you've brought your children up, only when you're on your own and you don't have a needy husband.
Well, and there are moments in
And
time, exactly.
yes, you've looked after your parents, you've looked after everything, you've discharged your obligations as a wife and mother and sister, whatever. Then you can be single minded and say, right, I'm not doing anything else. I'm just going to go every morning to my studio and make a piece of jewelry. I don't care what it is. I don't care how weird it is, how unnecessary it is, how shallow, trivial fluff it is. I'm going to do that. And it is that single mindedness that actually brings the art into focus. And my other passions like reading, gardening, all that comes into play now in my work. And also, art is very political. And these are times which you can't stay on the fence and say, I'm apolitical. There is no apolitical person. If you pay your tax and if you vote for a party, you're political. So art has allowed me to be political
So
in the
how?
right way.
Tell us how.
My trees are a cry, a cri de coeur for the environment
So these are the trees that you make out of silver.
that I make out of silver. I'm recreating maybe Eden that we lost, and we are so stupid we haven't yet learned that we've lost it and we need to go back. We are still destroying forests. We don't care for the environment. Trees are sentient beings. They were a civilization that was millions of years old, and human beings are a creature of the trees. And look how we've abused them. They are what gave us life. Could you imagine life on earth without a tree? So, my way of making trees is my politics, my green politics.
Some of the work you also do, Sultana, is with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Tell us about some of that work, because I think what you're doing there is helping them appreciate their own essence and how that can be reflected in Australia. And I think you use trees in that work too, don't you?
Always, always. Everything in the end is a tree. I tell people even plastic is a tree. It's a tree that
It
got
was. Yes.
dissolved into oil over the ages and then got made into plastic. So literally everything goes back to the tree. And when I work with, I did a workshop with Susie Vickery, who's the most amazing artist for CAN, Community Arts Network, with Middle Eastern women who had come from Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, the Middle East, which was so war-torn and destroyed. And these were women who hadn't had the leisure to do craft as we do, sit at home and do embroidery and sew clothes for their children. They were busy surviving,
Of course.
being bombed and shelled, and trying to find food for their families. So had no idea of what craft looked like, because they had to flee from their homes, seek refuge somewhere, and take the boat and literally escape sharks attacking their boat, not knowing if they'll reach their destination. They had no idea that actually reach their destination alive. And then they were put into prisons in Australia and treated like criminals.
Their resilience and their courage is incredible.
And I met these young women whose resilience and courage, the joy now in their lives with their children, the food they cook, they eat, the way they've settled, and how they love Australia was, for me, a transformative experience. And whenever you conduct and you say that you do a workshop, you get more out of it than you actually give.
I think going in there with an open mind and an
Yes.
open heart means that you will constantly receive.
We are receiving and seeing them. And we told them that we were going to do this. We called it a roadmap. And it was a meter and a half long strip of fabric. And we cut out a road, like a wavy, a long and winding road, from one end of that fabric to the other end of the fabric. And we told them, right, you start from your left. Of course, we forgot that Arabic starts
From the
from
right,
right to
yes.
left. So we should have made it that way. But again, colonized minds. We decided we'd start from the left and go to the right. And left is the home that they left, wherever that they left from. So we call that al-Watan, which means home in Arabic. So when you left home, you called it al-Watan. And then when you went through that long and winding road of hardship and trauma, and you finally reached Australia, in English, you called it home. So it was from Al-Watan to home, we called that project. And we told them, this is the road you've taken. Now put whatever experiences that come foremost to your mind on this road that you've taken to get here. And we had to call in a trauma counselor.
I was going to say that sounds like it could have actually
because
been
a lot of
quite
them
a traumatic
couldn't talk about it. They
experience.
said no one has asked us what we've suffered. No one wants to know what we've suffered. All we have to do is learn English and assimilate, integrate.
Yeah, don't worry about what happened.
Don't
You're
worry
here
about
now.
what happened. You're here now. Send your children to English schools. Get anglicized. Get westernized. And you are like precious beings, you know. If a Martian came down to Earth, you'd say, tell me about Mars.
Yes.
But these people are coming from these countries and we're not asking them, tell us about your culture, your country. We are assuming that it was inferior to what they left. And they are so lucky to be here in the superior culture. And what a mistake that is. So we told them, no, tell us, how did you live? What was the food you ate? Who were your family? Tell us, how many children did you have? Did you live with them? Did you live with your parents, your grandparents? How did you live? And we got their story out of them. And Cannes later had an exhibition of these, we call them banners. I wish the museum had bought it and preserved it, because these stories, we gave them back to the women who did them, and they didn't know embroidery because they had no time to learn embroidery.
No,
That is a
embroidery
cultivated craft.
Yes, I remember, just as a side note, Sultana, when I was in Israel, and there were these different types of calico clothes, if you like, that women would make in various different villages, and it
The Palestinian cross-stitch embroidery.
Yes, exactly. It was the Palestinians.
We had a lot of Palestinian women.
Yes. But only it depended on how peaceful your place was and how, I guess, how affluent your town was, as well as to how much embroidery was on those dresses, because that then showed how much disposable time the women had to decorate their clothes. Otherwise, they were very plain. I found that such a fascinating part of history and culture.
Yes, and so embroidery, like the cookbooks, were a story.
Yes.
And the Tatra, the cross-stitch Palestinian embroideries, we had Palestinians who were triple and quadruple refugees. They had fled Palestine to go to Iraq, then they had to leave Iraq and go to Syria, and then they had to leave Syria to come. So they had lost their homes over and over again. And these were the women who my admiration for them is unbound.
Likewise, Shaheen, you have spent a lot of your career looking at inclusion, diversity, and hope. Tell us about the Spice Mama route to that.
So I think Spice Mama was really also just a small tribute to this wider story of women, and women perform through art and craft their stories that they don't perhaps get to do through the history books, through formal means. Women all over the world demonstrate courage and resilience through food, through embroidery, through knitting, through things that have actually never had their rightful place. The work of women has always been secondary to men. But in my own family, in our very nomadic existence, it's mum that packed us up, that moved us around, that enrolled us into new schools, that helped us find new friends. It's women that packed up households and followed men and took children. And you look at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, the women and the children, and women carrying this enormous tragedy and legacy of the generations that they're responsible for. And they do it in such quiet, graceful ways. It could just be that meal that they'll put in front of a hungry family that reminds their family of home, or a simple dress they sew from a bit of material that's from years and years past, or from their mother's sari, or a small tiny trinket or piece of jewelry that's handed down. These are such small, graceful objects, and I think to honor them is incredibly important if we're going to forefront the work of women that has not seen the light of day. It really needs to, because the stories to unpack from a recipe book, a sampler of embroidery. We have a sampler of embroidery that my grandmother Zena did in convent school when she was 5. Women weren't free. Women sat in homes and sewed things with their hands when their men went off to war. And I think there's a real cathartic nature to doing something with your hands to hold trauma and to heal trauma that women have kind of, understood, because you cook, you chop, you feel, you sew, you take a needle and a thread, and in my storytelling work, it's that idea of narrative therapy, that you can actually tell a story when you're doing something with your hands while you do it. It's a trauma healing. Women speak in ways that are not words.
The invisibility is something that really struck me in how you're just describing the work of women and the voice of women. There is this invisibility and this under the radar approach. How do we bring it to the fore?
There is so much power in invisibility, and I think the worst thing you could do is I think because we can't see things in this day and age, they must not exist. And there's actually more power in what we can't see than what we do see, because it's how we look. And I think the secret is to look in places that we don't necessarily see stories, to shine a light in places that stories are not. We can read our mainstream newspaper, have a very, very blinkered worldview of the stories that are out there, because people are making decisions to shine lights on stories and not on others. And the power of the invisible stories in our community, the stories of the land, we have inherited land that stories have been written about for 60,000 years. This is a land rich and alive with stories. And sometimes we fumble for words and solutions to the crises in front of us. And we're not looking, we're just not looking around us at the stories the land brings, at the stories the animals bring, at the stories people bring. Therein are the answers. They're just not told how we expect stories to be told. They're not written in books and libraries with beginnings and middles and ends. They're written in small scraps of paper, or a falling leaf, or a cup of tea that you make in the morning. And I think to open our senses, to have a more multi-sensory perception of what a story is, how you tell it, and how you listen, is what's going to bring us closer to each other. Maybe it's the small, untold, invisible stories that actually hold the most power.
You've been listening to My Warm Table with Sonia Nolan. In Italian, a tavola calda is a warm and welcoming table where you can share big ideas, friendship, laughter and life. So much happens around the kitchen table, and I wanted to amplify it here in this podcast. My aim is to feed your mind and soul through smart conversations with heart. No topic is off limits, but good table manners rule. I hope you'll join us each week as we set the table for my extraordinary guests who will let you feast on their deep knowledge, life experiences and wise insights. Let's keep the conversation flowing. Please subscribe to the My Warm Table podcast and share it with your friends and networks. Perhaps if they are new to podcasting, take a moment to show them how to download and subscribe so they don't miss an episode either. I'd also love you to join our community on Facebook. You'll find the group at My Warm Table Podcast. Your support